from an 1872 pamphlet entitled Fictitious Splits in the International. Karl Marx. We now pass on to the sectarian sections. The first phase of the proletariat struggle against the bourgeoisie is marked by a sectarian movement. That is logical at a time when the proletariat has not yet developed sufficiently to act as a class. Certain thinkers criticize social antagonisms and suggest fantastic solutions thereof, which the mass of workers is left to accept, preach, and put into practice. The sects formed by these initiators are abstentionist by their very nature, i.e. alien to all real action, politics, strikes, coalitions, or in a word to any united movement. The mass of the proletariat always remains indifferent or even hostile to their propaganda. The Paris and Lyon workers did not want the Saint-Simonists, the Fourierists, the Icarians, any more than the Chartists and the English trade unionists wanted the Owenites. These sects act as levers of the movement in the beginning, but become an obstruction as soon as the movement outgrows them, after which they become reactionary. Witness the sects in France and England, and lately the Lassallians in Germany, who after having hindered the proletariat's organization for several years, ended up becoming simple instruments of the police. To sum up, we have here the infancy of the proletarian movement, just as astrology and alchemy are the infancy of science. If the International were to be founded, it was necessary that the proletariat go through this phase. Marx does not like the left. As Engels mentioned somewhere, he and Marx spent all of their time struggling against other socialists. And there's a very good philosophical reason for this. Because the socialist movement is an ideological movement, whereas the revolutionary communist movement is rooted in historical processes and the development of capitalism. And the left and the revolutionary movement are not the same thing. Again, I can cite multiple examples of this, but the one that I'm going to go to here is The Holy Family. This is a work, it's fairly obscure. It's one of Marx's more obscure works that he published around the same time that he wrote the German ideology. Give me a moment here. I know that this is amateur hour, but I'm doing this quite alone. Here we are. When socialist writers ascribe this world historic role to the proletariat, it is not at all as critical criticism pretends to believe, because they regard the proletarians as gods. Rather the contrary, since in the fully formed proletariat the abstraction of all humanity, even of the semblance of humanity, is practically complete, since the conditions of life of the proletariat sum up all the conditions of life of society today in their most inhuman form, since man has lost himself in the proletariat, yet at the same time has not only gained theoretical consciousness of that loss, but through urgent, no longer removable, no longer disguisable, absolutely imperative need, the practical expression of necessity is driven directly to revolt against this inhumanity, it follows that the proletariat can and must emancipate itself. But it cannot emancipate itself without abolishing the conditions of its own life. It cannot abolish the conditions of its own life without abolishing all the inhuman conditions of life of society today, which are summed up in its own situation. Not in vain does it go through the stern but steeling school of labor. It is not a question of what this or that proletarian, or even the whole proletariat at the moment, regards as its aims. It is a question of what the proletariat is, and what, in accordance with this being, it will historically be compelled to do. Its aim in historical action is visibly and irrevocably foreshadowed in its own life situation, as well as in the whole situation of bourgeois society today. So, there is no function here for a left. There's none at all. Marx is a historian, he's a critic of politics, but there is no role in his conception of things for the left that gets organized and listens to podcasts. You're not doing anything. You're driving a dialectic forward, yes. You're moving these social contradictions around, but the left itself is one thing, and the proletarian movement that abolishes capitalism is another, and never the twain shall meet.